Welcome to Birdlife on the Solway Coast webinar. It's nice to have you all with us. In case you don't know, I'm Claire McFarlane and I'm the Partnership Manager at Solway Firth Partnership. And this is my colleague Naomi Kay from across the Solway. So Naomi is the manager of the Solway Coast Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty based in Silla. So I'm on the based on the Scottish side of the Solway, but cover the whole of the Solway coast, and Naomi's based on the Cumbrian side of the Solway. So we started doing these webinars, obviously, because we weren't able to get together during COVID, but we've just kind of kept doing them because they've proved to be quite popular, and we've managed to kind of cover quite a good range of subjects. So it's a really nice way when we haven't been able to do our conference to cover the kind of topics that we use to celebrate the Solway Firth and the culture and the heritage of the marine and coastal environment. And let's say we've decided that we'd keep doing these kind of webinars because they have proved popular. So this will be the last one of this kind of series of kind of winter into spring this year. But if you want to know anything else about our organisations, then please visit our websites. It's quite easy just to Google our names. And you can see some of the projects that we've been working on and the resources that we have. And there's lots of great images on both of our websites from around the Solway. So I'll hand you over to Naomi, who is going to give you a little bit of an introduction about the speakers and the process itself.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm sorry for people who come on these webinars all the time, so I'm going to run through the same technical information. So I've said some of it already, so you can hear it again. But just to make sure that everyone's really clear. So we're running this session as a webinar rather than a meeting on Zoom. So it just means that as participants, your camera and video are automatically switched off. It just makes it a lot easier for the speakers to speak. But we still really like you to participate. So most of you have found this already, but there's a chat function on your screen, usually at the bottom, where you can post just comments, observations to everybody on the webinar, or just to hosts and panelists, to us. So feel free to use this, just click on it and that brings up the chat window. Again, like I said before, the only tip is if you're posting a comment, just make sure that you select the option all panelists and attendees instead of just all panelists, because it means the comments won't be seen by everybody, and it's nice for everyone to see some of the comments. We've also got a questions and answers option, which you'll find on your screen near the chat window. If you've got questions for the speakers, we'll have a bit of time for these at the end. So just post your questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll choose some of those to be answered, hopefully answered by our bird experts at the end. So just to let you know, the session's currently being live streamed on Facebook, not live streamed. And it's recorded as well, so it will be available in due course on YouTube, on both the Solway Firth Partnership and the AONB YouTube channels. And all you do is you just search go to YouTube and search for either of those or both of those organisations to find them. So I'm now going to just introduce our two speakers, starting with Andrew Belinsky, who is the RSPB Scotland Area Manager for the Scottish Lowlands and Southern Uplands. So Andrew's background, he's a zoologist by training with a particular interest in birds, mammals and amphibians. It's a wide interest. He's worked for RSPB Scotland for over 11 years, most of that time as Area Reserves Manager for Dumfries and Galloway. But in 2019, Andrew became the Area Manager for the Scottish Lowlands and Southern Uplands area, which is Dumfries and Galloway, Scottish Borders, South Lanarkshire, South Ayrshire and East Ayrshire, for those of you who are more geographically challenged, like myself. And then our other speaker is John Callian, who has spent all of his life on or close to the Cumbrian Solway coast. The last 20 years he's lived at Allenby. He first became interested in birds as a child, and he still pursues his passion every day. He was a co-author in organising and writing the Atlas of the Breeding Birds of Cumbria. He's got a particular interest in migration and recording and breeding biology of some small birds, especially stonechats and warblers. And he's also a licensed bird ringer, and he trains others to become ringers as well. So John is going to be playing some bird song as part of his talk, and we've had endless issues with sorting the sound out and practicing these. So I should really know this bird song off by heart now. It can be a little bit difficult to hear, especially the sort of less loud, the more subtle songs. So if you can, try to turn your own speakers up, and we'll hope that there are no glitches, but please do bear with us and we'll try our best. So Andrew was going to start off, so we're going to hand over to Andrew, and hopefully he can switch his sound. He's coming, I can see him coming. and we'll disappear, and we'll leave Andrew to start his talk. So hello, Andrew. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And bear with me while I get this up. Here we go. Oh, come on. Right, so I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some of our coastal reserves on the Scottish side of the Solway, and focus on just a handful of the species that we get on them. I'll need to try and get rid of this hide thumbnail video. There we are, that's better. So, running west to east, we've got the Mull of Galloway and Scar Rocks in the far west. We've got the Crook of Baldoon on the Wigtown Bay coast. We've got Merse Head, and we've got Kirkconnell Merse. So I'm going to run through briefly these four reserves and some of the key species that we have on them. So the Mull of Galloway is a very small reserve. It's about 12 hectares that we lease from the Mull of Galloway Trust, and it's a really good little reserve. It's the southernmost point in Scotland, so it's very, very popular site with our visitors, and it's got the full range of seabirds that you would expect. So we've got common guillemots, we've got razorbills, we've got shags. Not so many of any of these birds as we'd like, but we know that seabird populations are not doing as well as they might be doing. And we've got kittiwakes. But the bird I want to focus on particularly is the gannet. So out in the middle of Luce Bay, about 11 miles east of the Mull of Galloway, are 2 or 3 rocks. And this is the Big Scar. This is about a hectare in size, and it rises to about 25 meters in height. Gannets were first recorded breeding on this site in 1883, when 2 nests were found. And then not many people, as you can imagine, visit this particular rock. Certainly not in those days, they didn't. But steadily over the years, that population has increased. And in July 2014, there was an aerial survey undertaken by Mike Harris and some other seabird workers. And they identified 2,376 apparently occupied nests. So we don't count pairs of gannets. We count what are nests which are apparently occupied, hence apparently occupied nests. And that figure was actually very, very similar to an aerial survey that was carried out in 2004. So it may be that Scar Rocks is full now, and that there's no room for any more gannets. Anyway. This is the gannet. It's a superb seabird. That's the Mull of Galloway in the background, and this bird is got something like a 5.5-foot wingspan. It weighs 5 to 8 pounds, which is remarkably light, really, for such a big bird. And they feed up to 170 nautical miles from the colony, or they can do. So you see birds diving around the rock, but you also find birds going much, much further away. And there was some work done by Leeds University on tracking gannets, both on the Scars and also on Ailsa Craig, to find out some of their foraging habitats. And there's other work been done since. So we've learned a lot with radio trackers and satellite trackers. We've learned a lot more about seabirds and their activities. So they nest. They've got a very extended nesting season. They start nesting around about March or April. They start breeding when they're about 4 to 5 years old, and they lay one egg, basically, in what that is what constitutes a gannet's nest. You can see it's a mixture of seaweed and feathers and all sorts of stuff that they bring in, and the parents incubate for somewhere between 42 and 46 days. So it's a fairly extended incubation period. And after that, and that egg obviously you can just see it's starting to hatch. Now this is in July. So when I was on the scars, when I took these photographs, there was everything from eggs right through to almost fledged young birds. So as I say, it's quite an extended period, and you can still find birds, young birds on the site well into October. So they're born, as you can see here, featherless. They look very prehistoric to my mind. They look, pterodactylish. They're not the most attractive chick that you could find, but after about 2 weeks, they develop feathers and they start to put on a lot of weight. The young are fed for about 13 weeks by both parents, and they get through an awful lot of food. And after about somewhere between 84 and 97 days, they fledge. And that's an adult gannet. You can see the fantastic coloration on the head and that bill and the blue around the iris. These are, you see the yellow head when the birds are flying, but you don't always, unless you can get close up to them on a seabird colony like Bempton Cliffs or some of the Scottish rocks like Bass Rock and so on. You maybe don't appreciate just what a stunning bird it is. The young birds, there's about something like a 30% survival rate of young gannets up to the age of about 4 years of age. But after that, the adult birds will live for, well, there's something like a 92% survival rate from in adult gannets. And the average age is about 17 years. But from ringing studies, the oldest gannet found, which was obviously or presumably ringed as a fledgling, is just over 37 years. So it's a fairly long-lived bird. But they do have challenges, and again, that you could see here, this is the scars. Not only are the birds bringing in ordinary nesting material, as it were, like floating seaweed and so on, but they do pick up fishing nets, discarded fishing nets and so on. And you can see here, this is an adult gannet that's got caught up and has unfortunately died of starvation. Some of this will be washed up on the rocks as well at very high tide. But you can see here the detritus that's around it. We have thought about trying to go out there and clear this away, but I mean, it would be you'd have to do it in the winter, and it would be, well, you just wouldn't be able to get onto the rocks. It would be a horrendous job and almost impossible to do. So we kind of have to accept that these birds are, there will be some mortality just from getting tangled up. And it's not just the gannets as well. There are razorbills and guillemots and shags breeding in fairly small numbers as well. And we've often cut fine line away from the legs of some of the young birds, and hopefully they'll then survive. So moving on from the scars, we moving east, we come to the Crooked Baldoon on Wigtown Bay. This is a reserve that the RSPB's had since 2010. We acquired it, and we've been working away at it. When we bought it, this area here where the lagoon is, that was 27 hectares of short rotation willow coppice, and we removed that, and we've created these fantastic wetlands now. And this is the northern part of the site. So we've got, as with a lot of wetland reserves, you know, we raise and lower the water table, water levels rather, depending on the season and whether we want wildfowl on there or whether we're doing it for breeding waders, to encourage waders. So the winter on the bay is a really good time for pink-footed geese, which you can see here feeding out on the salt marsh, and there's around about 9,000 pink feet on Wigtown Bay as a whole. Not all of those come onto the reserve, but we certainly get 4,000 to 5,000. That would be about the largest number, and they come over in big skeins. It's fantastic to see them when they're going off to roost or when they're leaving the roost in the early morning during the winter months. And again here, it's quite a small goose, as you can see, and it's the characteristic is the small dark brown head that you can see there with the sort of pinky coloured bill, and not surprisingly pink feet. And these birds are with us, as I say, just in the winter, and then they head up to the far north to breed. And over the last few years, we're also seeing an increase in barnacle geese coming to the reserve as well, and we've now got somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 barnacle geese which use the reserve and the surrounding area. But I'll talk a bit more about barnacle geese when we get to Merse Head. Apart from the geese, we also have a regular group of flock of hooper swans. Somewhere around about 200 would be the maximum number, which come to us in the winter months as well. So not as many as you get at Calavrock, but a good number certainly for the west of Dumfries and Galloway. One of the other things that we are aiming to do is increase the numbers of breeding waders, and these are our sort of target species at the Crook, with the lapwing being having the largest numbers of breeding birds, the redshank, snipe we think are breeding there. We haven't proved breeding, but we're certainly hearing drumming males in the spring. And we hope we've created some islands in the lagoons with shingle and cockleshell toppings, hopefully to attract ringed plover as well in due course. And with all the bird activity, all the small bird activity and the larger bird activity, the wildfowl and so on, it's a fantastic place in the winter, particularly for raptors as well. So we get peregrine regularly feeding across the site, hen harrier, merlin, and short-eared owl as well. So it's a cracking reserve, and we're pretty proud of it. We've got more habitat creation work lined up over the next year or two. Moving further east again, and on the Nith, towards the mouth of the River Nith, we have Kirkconnell Merse. So the village in the foreground is Glen Capel, as you can see there, and opposite is Kirkconnell Merse. So this is a site the RSPB acquired in around about 2004 or thereabouts, and it's one of the largest expanses, I should say, of salt marsh or merse on the Solway. We have about 270 hectares that we own and manage through grazing with some local farmers. And then this is just a close-up of the merse there with the sort of pool system and so on. And again, the principal target here in the winter is to encourage the barnacle geese to come in and feed, which they do in good numbers. And then finally, moving over to Merse Head, this is a reserve that we acquired in 1993, and again it was a mixed dairy an arable farm when we bought it. And over the years, we've created a range of wetland features that you can see here. So those of you that are familiar with the site, that's my cursor is over on the visitor centre there, and that's the car park. So these are some of the first fields that you encounter. There's a hide here. And so we raise and lower the water levels to change the habitat suitability depending on the time of the year. And again, you can see we've created reed beds in here, but then other areas are just grassland. And we have a fantastic length of sand dune as well, and that's looking west towards sort of Coal Bend and beyond to the hills beyond. So one of the reasons for acquiring Merse Head was to help boost the population of barnacle geese, the Svalbard barnacle geese, which the entire population of which you'll probably all know visits the Solway in the winter. And the success story of the conservation of barnacle geese, going from literally a handful of birds, just a few hundred birds back in the 1950s, through to the peak population a few years ago of about 47,000 birds, is a remarkable conservation effort. And really we acquired, as I say, we acquired Merse Head to provide an additional area of foraging for them, to sort of match the work that WWT and SNH, now Nature Scott, have done over at Calaverock. And they're fantastic little birds. They're not a big goose, as you can see. They're extremely attractive, and they're with us for quite a long time. They normally come back at the end of September, and they're with us until the end of April. The last birds have only just gone from Merse Head in the last couple of weeks, heading back up to Svalbard, Spitsbergen as it's also called. And you can get remarkably close to them for a wild bird. I mean, the hedges along the main track are a good screen, and you can get very, very good views of the barnacle geese at Merse Head. And you'll be aware, no doubt, of the ravages that avian flu unfortunately hit the population this year. And the conservative estimate is that we've lost something like 14,000 birds out of the flock, which is over a third of the flock. And we hope that they manage to breed and they come back, and they don't come back with avian flu. But we just don't know what's going to happen. So there's some trepidation about, A, are they going to be fit enough to breed when they go back up to Svalbard, and B, are they going to make it back, and in what numbers? So that was a huge loss this winter. We also have some oddities that turn up. Now this looks like a snow goose, excuse me, but it isn't. It's actually a barnacle goose, and it's a leucistic one. And you can see the colouring in the back, that it has the bars that the normal coloured barnacle goose does, and it has the little black beak. But we do get snow geese occasionally. This was one that turned up about five or 6 years ago. And it's a chunkier bird, as you can see from the barnacle goose. It's got a big pink beak, pinky orange beak, and it's got the black in the tail and at the wingtip. So it does look very different to the leucistic one. And for the real goose aficionados, we also get some very strange Canada geese turning up. And Canada geese have been split many times now into what are called cackling geese, and there are different species of cackling geese or subspecies of cackling geese, depending on which taxonomic line you want to take. And there are lesser Canada geese as well. And this one here is a Todd's Canada goose. which is one of the little ones that, again, turned up a few years ago. And it takes, I have to say, quite a lot of skill and patience to go through big flocks of barnacle geese and pick out these odd birds here and there. But some people enjoy doing that and are very skilled at it. And it's also a cracking place in the winter for a whole range of other wildfowl. It's particularly good for pintail up on the top right here. You get some really good close-up views of pintail, but teal, widgeon and shoveler are also very common on the reserve in the winter. So it's a good all year round reserve, and we have breeding waders there as well. And the other speciality we have at Merse Head, it isn't a bird, but it's the natterjack toad. And this is what the reserve looked like in the winter of 2013-14, when we had a massive storm surge, and we lost quite a few hundred meters of sand dune, and the sea just poured in, and we thought we had lost or likely to have lost all our natterjack toads, which were mostly breeding in some artificial ponds that had been created. And the toads had been translocated there from a place called Southern S, which is further east. But in fact, when we started looking, we found that this was possibly the best thing that had been done, that could have happened, because the salt water killed off a lot of freshwater invertebrates that would have been feeding on the natterjack tadpoles. And the following year, we did put a lot of time and effort into studying the natterjacks, and we were finding 300 to 400 adult natterjack toads out on the site. So we've really focused a lot of our attention on the conservation of natterjacks at Merse Head, and it's one of our really charismatic species there, which are worth going along if we do natterjack walks at night when they're calling. And Rowena Flavel, who's our warden there, takes people out and shows them. So that's just a snapshot of our 4 reserves with a bit of focus on some of the key species. I will now stop sharing and I'll pass you over to John, who will take you through his talk. So thanks for listening, and any questions, pop them in and we'll pick them up later on. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew, and congratulations on your presentation. I'm going to talk tonight about a fairly complex group of birds. My title is called Birdsong, but I'm focusing on 6 warblers. And I know amongst you tonight there'll be different levels of knowledge, experience and ability. So I'm targeting this talk sort of towards the centre of what people will know. In the UK, we've got 13 different species of warblers, and 11 of them in Cumbria. I'm talking specifically about Cumbria, but all these birds are found on both sides of the Solway. But I'm focusing on the area close to where I live. I'm going to talk about willow warbler, chiffchaff, reed warbler, sedge warbler, blackcap and garden warbler. Warblers are the music makers of the countryside and the British woodland. They're amongst our smallest birds that we have. Willow warbler and chiffchaff are slightly smaller than a blueted. I'm trying to give you some comparisons here so you can get some scale. The other 4 are just less than the size of a robin. So they're very small birds. Many of you that don't have a lot of knowledge about these, you might know them as little brown jobs, because superficially they're very, very similar in plumage. They're brown greenish. However, each of them has a distinctive and diagnostic song, and that's really what I'm wanting to show you tonight. For those of you who don't know this, perhaps it can help you sort them out, because now, sort of late spring, is the time when they are singing still. After they're mated and have a nest, they tend not to sing. Only the males sing. All of these birds are trans-Saharan migrants. They're all insectivores. They arrive in March onwards, and they've generally left the UK by late September. So they're travelling from Africa, from Central Africa to the Solway Firth and back 4,000 kilometres each way every year. Apart from blackcap, whitethroat and garden warbler, only the females incubate for willow warbler, chiffchaff and sedge warbler. What I want to show you now is a map of the Cumbrian side of the Solway, and I'll show you the area that I'm talking about, because many of you who perhaps are still learning about warblers, I want to show you a really good place, easy to walk, where you can go and see these birds. And the stretch that I'm talking about is primarily from Maryport in the south to Allenby, where I live, still fairly south as far as the Solway goes. Halfway between between Maryport and Allenby is the England coastal path. It's flat, you can walk, you can cycle, it's fairly well undisturbed, and it's a corridor of habitat that suits not only warblers but lots of other birds like yellowhammer and linnet. You've got the coast on the western side where you can look at waders. But this corridor between the road and the coast on the western side and the farmland on the eastern side, the farmland is fairly parallel to the coastal path. The habitat for the farmland is virtually dead for wildlife. It's heavily chemicalized, sanitized. But this narrow corridor, which can be up to 100 meters wide in some places and down to 20 meters wide in other, is a treasure trove for small birds and birdsong. And one of my favorite places is Cross Canopy Car, which we're going to have a closer look at now. So on the right hand side, you can see an aerial photograph of the car in winter. It's fairly wet there, you can see. On the right hand side, you can see the road from Maryport to Silloth, which we're just going to put an arrow on there for you now. And immediately to the east of that is the coastal path, where you can walk from Maryport almost to Silloth undisturbed. And as I said, on the western side, the sea is very close, where there's lots of wading birds and passage birds in both spring and autumn. And you can see, come to the left of the aerial shot, you can see Cross Canopy Nature Reserve there, which is a treasure trove for birdsong birds, and it's a tremendous little reserve, very easy to get to. There's parking there, you can have a picnic and listen to the birds, and you can see from other aspects of the map, there's a bit of history involved there. There's a Roman mile fortlet 21, and there's a 17th century salt pans still there. So it's quite an historic place to be, lovely place to be, and one of my favorite places of all time. So what I would really want to do now is to tell you a little bit more about the habitats, because I've mentioned 6 species of warbler, but there are 3 groups of them. The willow warbler and the chiffchaff are what we call leaf warblers, which they inspect leaves for insects, and they are found virtually all along the path, and they're the most abundant and most widespread of the 6 warblers that I'm talking about. And then you have the 3 what we call scrub warblers, which are the garden warbler, the blackcap and the whitethroat, and they favour low vegetation like gorse and bramble, lots of that there. So that they're there. And then we've got the sedge warbler, which is a wetland warbler, and it favours the wet ditches, the reeds and the rushes that are there also. So in a very, very small area, you've got 3 diverse sets of habitats, which encourages a minimum of 6 species of warbler. And now's the time, really, You've got about 3 or 4 weeks left to go and hear this bird song and listen to learn and enjoy these lovely, lovely avian music makers. So what I'm wanting to do now is to go through the series of the 6 warblers that I'm talking about, and we're going to show you a photograph of each warbler, and then we're going to play the song so that you can identify them. This one is probably the easiest of the warblers to identify, but you will see as we go through that superficially they're very, very much the same, and most of them stay in cover most of the time. So it's very important, if you want to learn about warblers, to learn the song. This particular one, the chiff-chaff, it actually says its name. So we're going to play that for you now. That's probably the easiest one. These birds, they nest very close to the ground. They build a domed nest. They lay 6 eggs, white speckled with red, and they like to nest in low to the ground in bramble. That's one of their favourite places for them to nest. So that's the chiff-chaff, and it's the smallest of the warblers we have in the UK. This one is fairly obvious by name because it's called a blackcap, and we can see why it's called a blackcap, but it's only the male that has the black cap. The female actually has a brown cap. And amongst all the warblers, this is the only species of all the 13 that I've mentioned where you can actually tell the sexes on plumage, because all of the other 10 species, the males and the females are identical. So I'm going to play the song for you now of the blackcap. You can find blackcap and chiff-chaff nesting very close to each other, but blackcaps nest slightly higher off the ground than chiff-chaffs. They favour bramble, but they also like to nest in low pieces of gorse, and little holly bushes is one of their favourite places too. I found one last year in a little holly bush in Cross Canonby Car, and fortunate to be able to put rings on the legs of the chicks. Not from Cross Canonby, but the year before, some colleagues of mine, we ringed a brood of blackcaps, that's a brood meaning a nest of chicks, at Keswick, in June, and one of them in September was found at Land's End, alive, caught by another bird ringer, ready to make its journey across the sea down to Africa. So I'm going to move on now to the next bird. And this is a white throat. It gets its name because it has a white throat. Again, males and females are the same. And we're going to play the song for you now from the white throat. The white throat is quite different from the 2 species that I've mentioned before, that they sing from cover, whereas a white throat also sings from cover, but it also, the male has a flight display. So it will fly up into the air, 10, 15 meters, singing, and then it will sort of parachute down back to its favorite perch. But again, these birds, they're nesting all closely together. You can get all 6 of these nesting within about 100 meters along this coastal path. It's a super place to go to. So we're going to go on to our 4th bird, and this is the only one today that belongs to this group of reed warblers. This is a sedge warbler. It's a bird of the wetlands, and it's got a very, very chattery song, this one. Another thing that will help you identify this bird is that this also has a flight display, similar to the white-throat that I've just told you. But this bird nests in the wetter areas, even though they may only be nesting or have territories only 20 meters apart. They're nesting in different habitats, because that's the beauty of this place. You've got these very dry habitats, you've got the woodland edge habitats, and you've got the wetland habitats very, very close together. So you get all of these birds in a very short area, and it's a fabulous place. So we've got two more, I think, to go through. This one is the garden warbler, another Sylvia warbler, scrub warbler. And I think we don't have nightingale in Cumbria or even in the north of Britain. But I think after nightingale, this has got the sweetest song of all the British birds. It's one of the plainest of our warblers, but I hope you can agree that it's got a beautiful song, which makes up for its rather bland plumage. And they nest, again, close to the ground in shrubbery. They like thicker cover than blackcaps, but they nest very, very close together, and you can hear them singing against each other in the woodland edge there. So I'm going to move on to the last of the species. This is the willow warbler. The willow warbler is probably my favourite of all the warblers, because it's the one I learnt earliest as a child, and it's one that I remember my father showing me its nest near the village where I lived, which is not too far from here. It's also the commonest and the most widespread of all warblers in Britain. So that's given you a snapshot of 6 of the 13 warblers that we have in Britain, of which 11 of them are on the Solway. And that's just about me done, but as I conclude tonight, I want to leave you with a remarkable statistic. This is a 50-pence piece. This 50-pence piece weighs 8.6 grams, and it's the same weight as the willow warbler that we're looking at now. And while the 50-pence piece circulates around Cumbria and Dumfries and Galloway, the willow warbler each year flies over 4,000 kilometers south of the Sahara to Central Africa, then returns back to Cumbria or Dumfries and Galloway to within 100 meters of where it was born or where it bred the previous year. Not only that, in Africa, it replaces every feather in its body before returning north in spring. Then, after breeding here, replaces every feather again before heading back to Africa in the autumn migration. When I first learned that, I was astounded by it, and I'm still transfixed at how these little 50-pence piece substitutes, how these 50-pence piece birds can do remarkable things like that. And I just think birds are brilliant, and I've loved them all my life, and I continue to do so. And I hope you do too. And I urge those of you who don't already support conservation bodies here in Cumbria or Dumfries and Galloway, that perhaps you will and help stop and reverse the loss of habitats and species, because I think we all have an idea of what's happening with our wildlife and our habitats. So Hope you can give that some thought if you don't support things already. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'd like to hand over now to Claire and to Naomi to take us further.
That was great. It was really interesting, and I have to say the only bird song that I could identify before now is the chiff-chaff, for obvious reasons. So I feel like I can maybe go out and see if I can do a bit of listening and see if I can identify some more.
Yeah, I'd agree with that really, because on the Solway we often talk about you know, the geese and the overwintering geese, but that's really opened my eye. You know, which is great, absolutely fantastic to see Andrew's talk and all that sort of amazing habitat. But you know, we've got an absolutely great array of tiny birds there that I don't know very much about. So
we don't have any questions in the Q&A at the moment, but if anybody wants to ask anything, now's your chance. But before anybody else kind of gets a question in, I'll kind of quickly ask Andrew. I was kind of obviously looking at all those kind of habitats around that your reserves are made up at, and something that we've been kind of looking at quite a lot at is habitat restoration, and that's obviously kind of quite a big topic at the moment in terms of kind of nature recovery and restoration. Have you got kind of plans for any of the reserves to kind of, you know, restore, say, salt marsh, or I mean, you'll obviously be making wetlands in your kind of, you know, arable farms, but have you got any kind of plans to do any kind of salt marsh restoration?
No, we are managing quite large areas of salt marsh, but it's less restoration, more certainly in the terms of the Crookabal Dune. When we started, when we acquired the Crook, the merse there was very heavily grazed, overgrazed, in fact, mostly by sheep, and we've reduced the numbers. So we've kind of restored it in terms of the structure of the merse and the numbers of animals, livestock grazing there. And we've taken the sheep off, and we now just graze it with cattle. So it's more better management rather than restoration as such. And at the moment, we don't have any plans to sort of create more salt marsh. We are looking at Merse Head. We've got a very narrow strip of sand dunes, and we are in time hoping we're going to remove some fencing on the inside, the landward side of the salt marsh, of the sand dunes, and we're hoping that nature might start to, and we're going to again change the grazing regime so that the dunes actually maybe start to roll back in a more natural way, so that we'll build up a bigger depth of sand dune at Merse Head. But that's going to take quite a long time, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine. No, that's interesting. Yeah.
I should say as well, there was a stat which I meant to get in about the gannets, and John reminded me of it, talking about his remarkable willow tit migration. So our gannets at Scar Rocks, actually, I mean, they don't have as big a migration as the willow warbler, but they do, a lot of them do spend the winter off the coast of Senegal in West Africa. And we get recoveries from the ringing we've done on the scars. We get birds recovered from, certainly as far away as Senegal, and then other places like, the Portuguese coast and the north coast of, the bottom end of the Bay of Biscay and so on. So they do fly a long way in the winter. And of course, they're doing a lot of very long foraging trips as well when they're feeding the youngsters.
Great, thank you.
You would expect that from a big bird, like a gannet, not from a tiny willow warbler.
Do you want me to go for the next question? Because we've got a few questions coming in now, so that's really good. So some of them are along the same lines. So the first one we've got on a list is, when's the best time to visit any of the reserves that you've both talked about when you're new to bird watching? So if you want to start identifying birds from like a proper baseline, when would be the best time of day? I'm assuming that Katie means the best time of day, or maybe the best time of year, but maybe both. John, do you want to pitch in on this one?
Yeah, thank you. The area that I talked about is basically a deciduous habitat or a reed bed habitat. So it doesn't support very much in winter because most of the species that use that are insectivores, so they're migrants. I mean, if you eat insects, you can only eat them in summer because they're only here in summer. If you eat insects, you've got to get out. You've got to get out by autumn and get to Africa where there's insects there in our winter. So really, the best time I was talking about is probably from early April until the end of May along this coastal path to hear these birds singing. I mean, it's not a reserve as such on the scale of what Andrew's talking about, but it's a natural historic habitat. That corridor is unchanged apart from the coastal path, which makes the accessibility brilliant. You can go on your bike, you can walk, you can have a picnic, and you can just absorb it all there. But it's basically a habitat there from April until September.
Oh, that's great, thank you. I love that you're so passionate about that little corner of the A1B. It is so nice to. It is a lovely little corner, isn't it? Really, and sort of.
It's my soil. It's my soil, Johnny.
That's great. And can I Claire, just before you go on, there's another question which is sort of leading on to that a little bit, which is probably pitched on. Sorry, I've just missed Andrew out for that completely. So one of them is just an addition to that. Somebody very keen to see owl species along the Cumbrian side of the Solway. It might be that Andrew has some things to say about the Scottish side as well. Can anyone recommend a site or a place to visit where this person would have some good chances? I don't know if you've got any thoughts, John. I mean, move on to Andrew.
Well, I mean, there are 4 species of owl, but they're all different and they don't really cross over in habitat. Tawny owl is a woodland species. Short-eared owl is a moorland species. Little owl is a farmland species, and barn owl is a farmland species. Really, on my area of the coast, it's not so good for owls because the farmland is impoverished and there's not much woodland there. So, I mean, North Solway, near where you are, Naomi, on the Campfield Marshes or on the Glass and Moss, that's good for short-eared owl and barn owl. But down my area, it's not so good. This is warbler country down here.
You can't have everything.
Andrew, have you got any thoughts from the Scottish side around best time to visit reserves when you need to bird watching or anything about owls on the north side?
Any time of the year is a good time to visit a reserve generally. I mean, okay, woodland, somewhere like the Wood of Cree, which is an inland woodland site, is probably less good for birds in the winter because there are fewer birds in there in the winter. But it's a brilliant place at this time of the year. But the coastal reserves, even the Mull of Galloway is quite good in the winter because there are some resident birds there. But the other certainly Merse Head and the Crook are really good year-round reserves with different birds there. So at this time of the year the geese have gone, but we've still got some breeding wildfowl like mallards and gadwall and 1 or 2 other things, but they're very good for the summer migrants and for the waders that are breeding there. So you can hear different waders calling and see them. And then in the winter, obviously, they've got the range of wildfowl. So I think it depends on what it is you want to learn to identify. That will dictate when to go on to some of the reserves. And in terms of owls, the short-eared owls you get both at Merse Head and at the Crook in the winter, not in the summer because they do tend to be up on the moors, but they're a really scarce bird in Dumfries and Galloway now. Barn owls you can see on both reserves, especially in the winter hunting, but there are breeding barn owls at Merse Head as well, so you can see those year round. We don't have little owl in Dumfries and Galloway, unfortunately. We do have long-eared owls deep in the very dark conifer forests, which are not good for much else apart from a handful of bird species, in my humble opinion. And tawny owls, again, are fairly widespread.
Great.
I can add something. Can I add something about owls? I'm staying with the RSPB, Andrew, but I'm crossing into England now. The Geltdale Reserve, the Moorland Reserve, and the North Pennines, which is basically a heather reserve, which they because I don't know whether people know, but short-eared owls are ground nesters. They nest in heather on the ground, and there's quite a few pairs breeding there, and that's reasonably easy to see in the breeding season when they're feeding their chicks. Maybe worth a look at Geltdale Reserve, RSPB Reserve, near Brampton, just northeast of Carlisle.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Thanks, John.
Just moving on to another question then. Andrew, this one's for you, I imagine. Obviously, you saw the gannets on the Scar Rocks, but most people can't get out to see those. But where would be a good place to see gannets in Dumfries and Galloway?
Well, anywhere along the coast, really, you'll see gannets feeding because they do come out. I mean, if you go to the Mull of Galloway, you'll see them fairly close too. But anywhere along the coast, if you've got a bit of height. But even down at somewhere like Annan Waterfoot, you'll see them offshore feeding during the summer.
So do you get them on the Cumbrian coast as well then? Would you get them along that side?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. If you want to see them in really big numbers close to, then Bempton, RSPB Bempton Cliffs is only what, 3.5 hour drive from Carlisle.
You're supposed to be promoting the Solway. Don't send people away. Although it is great there, I've been there and it is really, really good. There recently.
Or I mean, Ailsa Craig would be the nearest big colony to us on the Solway, and we think that's probably where the gannets on the Scar Rocks have probably ultimately come from the Ailsa Craig population. But we've got what 2,300 apparently occupied nests. On Ailsa Craig there are something like 35,000 apparently occupied nests. So it's the third or fourth biggest gannet colony in the UK. It flip-flops with grassholm from one year to the next.
Wow. Good. Naomi, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, sure. So a question for John, but I think it could be for either of you actually, around sort of timings really, from Andrew Fielding, who says the swallows seem to have arrived late this year. Have the warblers also arrived later than usual?
I love this question.
Excellent.
I love this question because swallows are diurnal migrants, meaning they migrate through the day because they can feed on the wing when they're active. Warblers and things like cuckoos and other windchats, they are nocturnal migrants. They migrate at night and then they rest during the day and they feed during the day because they need to be in bushes or on the ground to feed. So there's two different migration strategies for swallows and for warblers. Because warblers are nocturnal migrants, they fly higher than swallows, and generally they're flying higher than the bad weather. I know in April, I have a friend who lives in northern Spain, and there's a cold front of weather that was static over the Pyrenees between France and Spain and blocked diurnal migrants like swallows, swifts, house martins. So because the warblers are nocturnal migrants, they overflew the bad weather. And because swallows are diurnal migrants, they were held up. So that's my answer to that question.
Well, that's interesting.
That's so interesting. I didn't think that at all. So how interesting.
I'll ask the next question. So there's a few questions actually about ringing, John. I don't know whether, Andrew, you do ringing as well, but Hugh, hi Hugh, he's asked kind of typically on average, how many warblers do you ring per year? But that also brings in the kind of, maybe you could speak a bit wider about why you ring, and what information you get from that, and
well, I can do
tell
that.
us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I can do that. I don't know whether Andrew wants to input this as well. Are you a ringer, Andrew? I don't know.
I am, yeah.
Okay. Well, our group sort of focuses on small passerines. Passerines are perching bird, so we focus on small passerines. And within our group, there's 10 of us, and I'm the lead sort of ringer and trainer. But there's quite a few people. What I have to say, within the 10 of us, 7 of us are ladies, and I'm not one of them. But, well, I said, yeah. I find ladies are far more dexterous than men, because most of the birds we catch them in these fine mist nets, which, if you've not seen one, it's probably too complicated to tell you tonight. A bit like a tennis net strung across a court, but very fine mesh in cover, 3 or 4 shells high, and you catch birds in it. We ring in different sites, including Cross Canterbury Car. We ring about Watch Tree Nature Reserve, ring in my garden here, and we ring in other people's gardens. So we probably catch about 2,000 warblers each year.
Wow.
Of about 9 species, mostly the willow warblers. So yeah, and what we found with the willow warbler and sedge warbler, as they can't fly directly from the Solway to Africa, they have to stop. And what we found through ringing is that there are several stop-off places for them, and most of them fly directly from the Solway to north central France on the Atlantic coast. They then overfly the Pyrenees to southern Iberia, and they fatten up again. They put about 20% fat reserves on before they're able to, because they use a lot of energy flying, and then they directly overfly the Sahara. So they do that in 3 or 4 stages. And don't forget the 50-pence piece model that I've given you tonight. It's fantastic.
That's so interesting. Why do you train? There's obviously a real concern, I think, around wildlife recording that the next generation don't have the skills to be able to record or identify, because we're learning different things in school and not getting involved so much. Is that a concern to you, and do you sort of try to get younger people involved, or have you got any thoughts on that? Probably to John and Andrew.
Do you want to go, Andrew? I can go, but do you want to go?
Yeah, go on, Andrew. I keep forgetting to ask Andrew as well.
Yeah, it is a concern, and I belong to the North Solway ringing group, and I think it's fair to say that we are an ageing group, or we had been an ageing group, but in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had quite a few younger members join, largely because younger folk have joined conservation organisations, or they've moved in. So one of my colleagues in the RSPB is in the ringing group, and he's in his early 30s. So compared to some of the ringers who are in their 70s and 80s, so it's brought the demographic down. So it is important that we get younger folk. I mean, my daughter is a trainee ringer, but because I don't do as much ringing as I should be doing and as I'd like to do, she's suffering in terms of having me as a trainer, which isn't ideal. But we'll get there.
Well, she's very welcome to come to England.
I'm sure she.
But on a similar vein, we've got. I've just taken on 2 new trainees. One's in their late 20s, others very early 30s. One of them's an academic, and one of them isn't. So it's quite encouraging. I'm trying to get my grandson involved. He's shown some interest. He's 10. He's shown some interest, but yeah, I mean, I agree. It is a worry, but we need to persuade people through example why it's important for conservation bodies, and we shared interests like you know, ANOB has with other agencies like the Natural England. I don't know, I'm not certain about your situation, Claire, but you know, setting example and persuasion, I think, is the way that we do it.
Mm. Absolutely, yeah.
I'm just looking at the totals, the ringing totals for our group last year, and we ringed a total of 5,443 birds, and probably about 800 of those would have been various warblers.
Wow. It seems like a big number. You know, that seems like a really good effort.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the birds are ringed as what we call pulli, so they're nestlings. So like pied flycatchers, for example, we only caught 11 adult pied flycatchers. But we ringed 300, no, it's more than that, sorry, 37. We ringed 305 nestlings, you know, pulli in the nest.
That really is one of the benefits of ringing. You're able to ring most passerines, these small blackbird size down when the chick's in the nest. And what that gives you, it gives you information. You know the age of the bird and you know the origin of the bird. When you catch a bird in a mist net, you don't really know exactly where it's come from or where it's going to. And you can age and sex them based on training and experience. But actually ringing a bird as a chick in a nest really gives you the total amount of information that's available. Because don't forget, when you put a ring on a bird's leg, it's carrying information into the future. If they were talking about migrants out of this country, across Europe, into Africa, across the Sahara. I mean, swallows go to South Africa. I don't know whether people know that. Swallows go to South Africa. You know, and these birds, they're all individually and uniquely marked. So you know exactly what bird you're talking about. And technology is moving forward now, especially on bigger birds. You can fit them, because when you put a ring on a bird's leg, the bird needs to be caught again to get the information. But there's technology, radio transmitters, all sorts of IT stuff that someone my age doesn't understand. But they're all getting lighter, and some of them are fitting, I think, Andrew, on birds as light as nightingales that weigh 20 grams, I think, something like that. I know Stephen Westerberg at Geltdale is putting transmitters on wind chats, which weigh just maybe 20 grams, maybe slightly under. So you're getting live information. You can track the bird as it migrates. So ringing is almost like 100-year-old now, and it's gradually being, I wouldn't say phased out, but because you can't put transmitters on chicks. You have to be adult birds to do that. So ringing's got a place. But we have to remember that ringing is a conservation tool. We can only protect birds and their habitats if we know where they are, where they go, why they go there, and how long they stay there. That's the reason I do it. That's the reason everyone in my team does it.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Well, there doesn't seem to be any more questions in the Q&A. Have you got any more questions, Naomi?
I've got loads, but I can't take all night. I've got another. Sorry, I've got another question. I suppose it's sort of a final one for me, really. I mean, we've talked tonight about nature reserves, haven't we, on a really small scale, like Cross Canopy Car, even though it's surrounded by lots of other habitat, but also, like really big reserves like the Mercers and the RSPB reserves in the north, and we've got obviously lots of other reserves, the RSPB reserves in Cumbria, which are fantastic. It's not all about birds in reserves though, is it? I mean, we can play such an important part, can't we, in creating habitat or feeding birds or not, or what's the big thing that we could kind of do really as ordinary people with a garden and a normal house to try to help birds?
The answer to that is lobby your MPs to put through really meaningful, transformational agricultural support systems that enable farmers not to just have to produce to the maximum amount of food they can, but that actually delivers a really biodiverse countryside. Because it's farmland, but it's these wider species like lapwings and curlews and, you know, a lot of the other farmland birds that you can think of that have declined because of intensification. And it's not the farmers' fault, it's they're following, you know, government policy. We've got a chance now to change that, and that would be one of the biggest things you could do. Yes, you can do stuff, you can attract birds to the garden with nest boxes. You can do a hell of a lot for swifts, which are a red listed bird, by putting up, you know, very simple swift nest boxes under the eaves of your house. But really, ultimately, it's that wider countryside that needs to be managed better, and by getting politicians to listen and pass sensible agri-environment schemes, that would transform Britain's birds, I have to say.
I would say bravo, and I agree with you. However, I do think Naomi's got a good point. While that isn't happening yet, gardens can be valuable mini reserves for wildlife. My garden, some people would say I was a lazy gardener, but I'm a wildlife gardener.
That's me too.
Me too.
So I think, you know, I mean, I totally agree with Andrew, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen overnight, if it happens at all. I think gardens are really, really important. Maybe more so for insects, perhaps more than birds. The reason I think that we need so many reserves is because the countryside's a desert.
So just moving on, we've just got one last question that I'll ask before we kind of wrap up, because I don't want to keep people too long. But Carol's just asking, I'm not sure who's best to answer this, perhaps Andrew, since you've been dealing with bird flu. Are birds developing any natural immunity to bird flu, do you know?
We don't know, I think, is the honest answer to that. I mean, that bird flu exists in a lot of different strains, as does human flu, as does coronavirus now. And bird flu is always present in wild birds, and presumably in domestic poultry as well. This particular strain, though, that originated in the far east, but we now know it originated in China, was a particularly virulent one, and that the birds just weren't ready to deal with that. Now, some birds presumably will survive it, and hopefully, you know, will develop some immunity to that particular strain. But who knows what the next strain will be? It might be a very mild one that the birds doesn't affect. But last year, the great skewers were affected by avian flu up in Shetland. They've come back to breed on Shetland with avian flu again. So we don't know, and there were quite a few died, not in the numbers that the barnacle geese were dying. So, you know, there's a lot of work, a lot of research could be done on that, but because it's wild birds, it's probably going to be less pressing for the, you know, veterinary science to be looking at wild birds compared to domestic birds, which is, you know, multi-million-pound industry.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really interesting, and I think we're going to have to wrap it up there so that people kind of get away. But that's just been really, really fascinating, and I've learned loads, and I'll